Hey there everyone, how you doing today? Carpo is my name and making videos is my game. So today's video is going to be about probing the annals of life, probing the depths of the human mind and figuring out what it means to be conscious and alive. Obviously I'm not going to cover all these topics, and obviously I'm not going to be able to get my point across on a lot of them. And this video may very well be a surface barely even scratching the surface of what I would really like to convey. Button my shirt up a little bit here so I'm not like Mr. like Italian man. Definitely not Italian. So what I've got here is this sheet that I was working on this morning, and I made a video yesterday about nitrous oxide and whether or not it may be an antidepressant. And I grew up believing, of course, that it cuts off circulation to your brain. And that's the head rush. Of course, years later I said there's just something more to it. And plus they're not going to knock you out in a dentist's office with something that just cuts off circulation or oxygen to the brain. So further research inquiring into it led me to understand that it affects the NMDA receptors. And it has to do with preventing glutamate from binding, therefore preventing your body from receiving the pain signals. And this is how anesthetics work to an extent. Now, anesthetics are still a mystery as to the total mechanism of action. And the more I look into psychedelics, disassociatives, the more I realize that as much as science would love to think that they have the answers to how these things work, there are certain aspects of it that just don't make sense. There's more to it than just the H5T2A, the 5-HTP and the things people take for serotonin production or precursors like L-dopa for dopamine. And there's a whole lot more to it than just taking substances and getting an effect. This morning I woke up at about 1 in the morning last night, and had this. I was just I was inspired to grab some nitrous. I had a box of the Whippets, and I proceeded to go and lay in complete silence in the living room. Complete silence, complete darkness, and also removed all external feelings. Now, this may sound funny to somebody who's never done it, but holding the nitrous crack or the whipped cream thing, it gets cold, on the hand. Just that small amount of feeling can throw off the insight that you can get from the experience. In other words, any external distraction, whether it be a sound or a breeze of air, anything that brings you back into your body, it reassociates you, okay? And the whole point of a disassociative is to separate yourself from your physical essence so you can sit on the verge of this consciousness and certain things will come forward and surface. I can't really explain it or get into the details, so I've got, I have this little list I was making, and I have a little chart of 4 circles interlocking. One's the ego, one is time, one is environment, and one are the senses. And what I'm doing is trying to associate all the different compounds with how they affect our senses and which ones overlap. In other words, the experience I have on nitrous oxide, last night for the first time I realized that it's very similar to salvia. Now, I've only done salvia a few times, and it was very strong. It was a 60x extract, and somebody gave it to me, and I took a big toke, and wow, it blew my mind. But it was a little too much. People will tell you that salvia is a psychedelic. Others will tell you that it's a psychedelic disassociative. But really what we have to realize is all these terms are just terms. They're just words. All they're trying to do is describe something. What is a psychedelic? Okay? A psychedelic has to do with God. Okay? It's psychedelic. It's seeing God through the mind, if you will. It's a divine experience, almost, by definition. And disassociative, by definition, disassociates you from your senses. And one of the, about a year ago, I did a video where I talked about REassociates. Now that's my word. I'm coining this word. I'm going to own this one. REassociates are psychedelics, in my opinion. Any particular psychedelic or dose of a psychedelic that shows you yourself again, okay? And I had, on the video I made last year about this, somebody said, well, I don't believe there could be a reassociate because you're always associated. And I would say, well, what I mean by reassociation is bringing back those important points about yourself that you forgot or that you may have set aside. When people do psychedelics, these ideas and patterns come to mind, the myths, the legends, the power, the energy, all these things come forward, and you can literally pick through and file things away and figure out what's important. And it's a very subjective experience, of course. If you've never done any soul searching in your own life and you take psychedelics and you're not going to go into your mind and process anything unless you're prepared for it. However, it will kind of pull you in that direction. You'll be forced to see things about yourself that you didn't want to see. And this is what in the past has turned a lot of people off from taking psychedelics. But here's the interesting thing about psychedelics, like LSD and psilocybin. You can take them and you can go off on this crazy mind journey, and you might get to the point of what they call ego death. And there's varying opinions on what that means. Some folks would say that it means that you've lost your semblance of who you are. For me, it's, of course, the more subtle version of realizing that you are just a part of the whole. But either way, it's a very profound experience. And with psychedelics, when you're even in really high doses, you can tend to still find yourself. There is that little bit of you that's still you. Now, if you go over to disassociatives, as well as ketamine, N2O, and even salvia, you can actually kind of lose touch with yourself and who you are. And this is what makes disassociatives different than psychedelics or reassociatives. And I find it fascinating. This is, of course, a drug culture thing, and a lot of people would scoff at these ideas by saying, well, you're just polluting your brain with chemicals. And I would say, no, I'm actually using catalysts in order to tell my brain which chemicals I want it to produce or how I want it to act. In other words, we are in a little more control of our minds than we were in the past. Let me give you an example of where I'm coming from, because a person may say, well, you shouldn't mess with nature. Nature made us this way. So my retort to that would be, nature also gave us 2 million years of evolution in which we feared getting eaten, falling off cliffs, and dying, freezing, and starving. Only in the last few hundred have we actually gotten to a stable society where that excess fear is no longer necessary, and fight or flight has become something that actually causes us many problems and health issues. If there's a particular substance a person can take that will alleviate some of those stress, some of those tense feelings, the only issue becomes, is the medicine more harmful than the feeling of stress? Now, this is the reason why a lot of people take drugs. It's not just for the sense of, obviously, to get high, but what is the high? It's a novelty, in one sense, which is breaking away from the norm and taking a little mini vacation in your mind. It's something to look forward to because it gives people, an excitement, maybe a beer at the end of the day or whatever it is. It allows people to search parts of their mind that aren't available in conscious waking state. And a person may say, well, meditation will get you there. And I would say in the Western world, meditation isn't always conducive to our lifestyles. But more than that, psychedelics actually give people a glimpse into other parts of themselves that they can further process or search for later. Now, for those who say that psychedelics will make you stupid, kills brain cells, all of this is just fodder. Push it to the back. There's no evidence for any of this. Pretty much breathing oxygen kills brain cells. Okay, everything we do kills brain cells. We're always dying and being reborn. The question is, what can we use to help ourselves along the way? And so for me, I've kind of set aside the society stigma that says drugs are bad, okay, and realized that as the brain is constantly bombarded with various compounds from the foods we eat, the air we breathe, everything is affecting our mental state because our mental state is a product of the environment. Okay? Now, this is separate from consciousness. Our mental state, our faculties, being able to associate my hand with something that I'm holding and to look at the wall and stare at an area and know it's not going to change. Having that consistency is something that we take for granted, right? So what I found is that taking disassociatives allows a person to yearn for that again. In other words, when you're really out there and you finally come back to reality, you have a newfound gratitude for it, to realizing, wow, you know, if I couldn't remember who I was, that would be horrible. If I forgot what I'd done in my life, that would be horrible. If I couldn't feel my body, that would be horrible. All these things. But so it gives us a glimpse of how wild and crazy our minds could be. And I'll tell you an example of how I've applied this, this perspective of get really high so you can respect sobriety. It happened to me at Burning Man this year, or at Soak, the regional. I took some LSD with somebody, and we were just starting to peak, and we decided to take another one just to make sure. And this is very common, redosing before it's kicked in. Well, within a minute, I regretted it because I realized how high I really was. And at the same time, after I took that, I was actually filling up a nitrous thing with like 2 or 3 whippets. And then I proceeded to take the whippets, and that feeling of panic that set in, it was because I realized I didn't want to take this much. But after that nitrous hit had worn off after a couple minutes, the comparison between how high I was during the nitrous hit and where I came down to into my acid trip made the acid trip seem like nothing. In other words, so if you've suffered a lot of pain in your life, then breaking your arm's not going to hurt you that much. You know, if you're the kind of person who doesn't have that comparison to make. So I found that the psychedelic aspect of it, it may very well be something that people could use to help people to come down from bad acid trips by taking, say, a nitrous hit. And it made me think, because it's an NMDA agonist, so how does this play into psychedelics? One of the most interesting things to me is that psychedelics, like mushrooms and LSD, it's my belief that they are a partial NMDA agonist. And I may be wrong, I'm still looking into this, but this is the part of it that kind of separates you from yourself. But they're far more of like a 5-HT2A receptor, I believe, is the how they affect serotonin. But it's also believed that they may affect dopamine. However, we have the triad, the dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, or adrenaline. So all of these things help us. The serotonin helps us to feel normal. Okay, this is just a general layman setup. Serotonin helps us to feel good, feel normal, feel good about life. Dopamine helps to trigger us through the reward and punishment. And dopamine isn't just released when you get something good. It's also released, apparently, when something bad happens to you. It also warns you as well as rewards you. And then you have the obvious, adrenaline, which is, fight or flight. And so finding the balance of these, you want to make sure you're not activating too much of your fight or flight. You want to be relaxed, but you don't want to be so relaxed that you just fall asleep. And so that's why these compounds that are being worked on, such as, the research chemicals, are so interesting, although they're scary. People need to be very wary. I personally won't take anything on the market that's coming out in this research chemical category because I find them to be too unreliable. We have things like N-Bohm out there, which, it's usually taken sublingually. But in the improper dosages, it can cause all sorts of problems and palpitations and even death. And there has never been a death known from ingesting psilocybin mushrooms. So for somebody who doesn't know psychedelics, they may be surprised to learn that there have been no deaths attributed to psilocybin mushrooms or to LSD directly. However, there have been a couple isolated incidents where people have had reactions due to that, and obviously people who have killed themselves while under the influence. But it's always been funny to me how people demonize psychedelics by saying, you may go crazy. And I think, what is a drunk person? They're slurring their speech, they forget what they did, they don't even have any memory, they might black out, and that's societal norm. That's what we do. Go out and drink. Don't get too drunk, and so there's the group who's taking psychedelics, and then the group who's drinking, and drinking is socially acceptable. When psychedelics bring us closer to who we are and what we want to achieve as humans, to show us that life isn't just material, or to maybe create a delusion in our minds to show us there's something greater that may or may not exist. And honestly, I'm not here to dispute that. I will not dispute the fact that psychedelics show you a glimpse of truth because I know it to be true. I won't go as far as to say that that truth is something external from us. I believe that it's already known. But then again, I also believe that we're all part of this universe as a circuit, if you will, or a cell within the whole, and that we all are connected on that level. That there's no space between me and you. Not even through space. You're watching this video through space and time. You're watching it at a different time than I made it, but I'm still right here, okay? It's all a matter of perspective and perceptions, you know. We are all connected in one way or another. It's a fascinating thing. And when people say, you know, well, that may or may not be true, I always think about, like, as far as psychic communication or something like that, I always think about the, for example, a telephone wire, okay? Is there sound going through the telephone wire? Of course not. The information is being converted into electrical signals and just magically appears on the other side, because now we understand how the science works. My belief is that everything that we think, say, feel, or do is converted into electrical signals which are sent out to the universe into what some may call akasha, and that these can be tapped into if we are tuned into the right frequency. And that I believe some of these substances tune us into those frequencies. There's too much to explain, and it's too complex. I don't even understand what I'm saying half the time when I'm trying to define the experiences I've had. But I'll notice when I take a particular psychedelic, it will bring me back to a time when I had taken it previously. And it will bring forth realizations and memories that I've had. And for those who, you know, I've discussed with people whether bringing things back from a psychedelic experience is really valid. I've written down plenty of things when I was on LSD which were very revealing to me at the time. However, when coming down, it didn't seem to mean that much. And I've found that a side effect of NMDA receptor activity is that people can have a profound experiences or find meaning in things that may or may not really exist. In other words, making connections that may not be there. And that to me is kind of a letdown in one sense. It might mean that some of the experiences we have are delusions. But on the other hand, it's also a matter of what is really not important. Is there anything that's not important? Because if it's in the front of your mind and it's something that you need to process, who can tell you that it's important or not? Some folks may say God is important. Other folks may say just living is important, but really none of it is. Kind of leads me back to a comment that I read the other day. Somebody left, said that just, you know, that life is meaningless and that, you know, being alive is just a point in time and it really means nothing. And it just reminds me of that old saying, whether or not you believe it, that's you're right. You know, whether you believe it to be right or wrong, you're correct. We create our own realities. Back to the Descartes, you know, he says, I think, therefore I am. And to me, that's a very simple way of saying that, no, we can't prove anything. We can't prove anybody else is real. But there's a lot of talk about whether or not humans are real, whether or not we're alien species, or if we're interdimensional, if we're living on planes with, you know, what might happen later or before, or whether or not time is real. Some people don't even believe history really exists. I just say it's all fodder. Move it to the side and look at now, because now is what really does matter. And you have to learn to wade through it to realize that. You can't just embrace the now without understanding later and before. You have to have a fully rounded view of what really matters in order to hang on to that reality of now. And at the same time realize that you also have to go out and do shit. You can't just sit on your ass. You can't just wait for the universe to bring you everything. And that's, I believe psychedelics tell us what we need to do. And disassociatives as well. They tell allow our brains to quiet themselves enough to push to the forefront the things that we truly, in our deepest, darkest thoughts, believe are important. And that's going to differ from most people, but there will always be a common thread that everyone will experience. And that's that there is a connectedness within us all, some common thread. Maybe we can't define it, maybe we can't measure it, but we are all connected on some level, one way or another. That there's more to life than just gaining material possessions. Yet at the same time, and this leads me back to, actually, I'm glad I remembered this, a comment that Angel Beer left on my video earlier that said, well, I was trying to figure out how to define it. I don't want to lose my train of thought, but that total brain fart. I guess it doesn't matter. It must not be that important to me, or else I would have remembered it right. No, it was. I was trying to figure out how to define this, and it was, we're talking about, okay, so when we push things to the front of our mind, we start to realize deeper things about ourselves, okay, that we may have lost in the past. And, oh, that's right, I knew it would come to mind. Angel was talking about possessions and how materials have lost their luster, material life, material things, and they're not as exciting. And I totally understand that. I realized, though, I came to a point of full circle where I realized that the pendulum swings back and forth, but and it never sits still. But that at a point you realize that material goods won't make you happy. And then you may sway the other direction. Some people abandon. I've had friends who left all their material goods behind and went off. One friend that went to be a Hare Krishna, and a few years later he ended up committing suicide. So it shows that it doesn't matter which path we take. It's about what we're yearning for inside. But abandoning material possessions is great for a while, but you eventually realize that we need, and I'll put it this way, without materials, then the consciousness has nothing to build upon. And without consciousness, the materials have no observer. So they're integral, they're one and the same. The observer is the effect is the observer, and the material is everything. So enjoy what you have, embrace the fun things that you want to do in life. Don't hold yourself back or become an ascetic because you think that God doesn't want you to have fun things. Because we wouldn't be living on this wonderful planet with all these beautiful things around us if we weren't meant to embrace it. So, in a nutshell, I guess psychedelics to me show me a little depth about myself and my world, and that is growth, in my opinion. And hopefully it's not, well, it's not for everybody, but hopefully it continues to be something that I benefit from, and I'm glad to know that others do too.